Heroes aren't always the ones standing in the capes or in the spotlight. They can occasionally be spotted in the peaceful regions of the planet where nobody. When someone is observing, they occasionally have. They stand despite their matted fur and weary eyes. Robust in the face of life's storms. Since loyalty and love don't provide them. Alternative option, Max was merely a stray, a forgotten soul walking the streets. Lacking a place to go back to, but he decided. When no one else was around, he noticed Linda. And he supported her despite her hunger. Through the cold and silent nights. In doubt, he wasn't merely a dog, he served as a friend, a guardian, and reminder that wealth is not necessary for love. Or standing to be honest, Keanu lacked. He could have taken a walk to stop that evening. Away as a lot of other people had, but he saw a woman and her dog, didn't he? Battling for their lives, and rather than with his back turned, he extended his hand and used what he didn't have for attention. Acknowledgement, but because it was the proper action to do throughout their time together was quick, yet its effects lasted for a long time. Who had observed and waited that evening? You with more than simply a tale to share, they departed with the awareness that there is still kindness. That a single action can have a cascading effect, altering lives in ways that might not. Entirely visible. Linda's discovery of hope once more. Max discovered a way out of the streets and somewhere in the world's vastness, someone else heard their tale and perhaps, just perhaps, they made the decision to something beneficial for another person, because heroes aren't always the people we anticipate, but the ones we most need. Days go by, and Linda continues to struggle. To think she's no more sleeping on chilly concrete, huddled under light blankets as the city continues without her at the hotel. Keanu made sure the bed was cozy and comfortable. Possesses his own cozy dog bed, but he still likes to curl up next to her at night, as though worried that she would vanish. The employees are polite to her, although just plain respect, no condemnation or sympathy. Things she hasn't experienced in a year. A woman shows up at the motel in the morning, identifying herself as an employee. She informs Linda with Keanu that plans have been established for something more substantial, a tiny apartment that is simple but secure and hygienic. As long as she requires it, Linda listens to her hands in startled silence, holding Max's fur while nodding, unable to create the phrases that convey the weight. Removing herself from her shoulders doesn't. Max is being taken for a complete. He receives vaccines and a veterinary examination. Fresh toys, new food, and a nice bath. Linda observes him dancing around the space, tail wagging like he's happier and healthy. Is aware that their lives have changed irrevocably.
She tells herself as she wipes her eyes at only dust, but in reality, she hasn't. Sobbed like this for a while. After a few days, Linda awakens to something. Her name is unexpectedly in the headlines. People are discussing her in the headlines. Strangers on the internet are sharing stories. Videos taken by the cafe that evening, applauding Max's courage and being amazed by Keanu's articles on his silent charity. Showed information about how he not just found a home for Linda, but also made that Max was protected, well cared for, and never a journalist who is separated from her reaches, out requesting her willingness to. She is initially hesitant to relate her story, afraid to speak, but when she sits down with Max in front of the camera, she's nestled up next to her and understands precisely what to inform them that she talks about Max's. Discovered her one evening when she had almost renounce his role as her protector, the only person in her family who never. She informs him that she was abandoned in a world that frequently ignores humans. Max didn't like her, but he kept her going. When she was completely exhausted, and then a stranger spotted them that night and took the. She also talks about Keanu's generosity, his refusal to turn it into a show, how he had just offered assistance without asking. She informs him for anything in exchange, how everything changed at that instant. She was reminded that individuals can still be. Wonderful how one act of kindness may alter a person's whole future. The narrative is now spreading even more widely, not simply regarding the kindness of a well-known actor, but about the bond between a woman and her dog that sustained them and the generosity that allowed them to sit again. Max cuddled up next to her in her new house. Linda gazes at the metropolis beyond the window. At one point, she seemed very unforgiving, has no idea what the future will bring, but she thinks for the first time in years. Once more, she glances down at Max. He smiles and strokes behind his ears.
Perhaps, just perhaps, things can shift as Keanu leaves. He arrives at taking his phone out of his pocket, and his voice called a number he knew. Forceful but composed when he addresses his. He provides them with the address of A, telling them to reserve a room at a nearby hotel. Accessible space for Linda and to ensure they don't make any exceptions for dogs, he says. Looking back at Max, who remains observing him with those devoted, perceptive eyes. As he continues, his voice becomes a little softer. Instruct them to set up veterinary care as well. Food supplies, anything Max needs. The helper pauses just a moment, prior to answering with a brief yes, sir. Keanu tucks his head before the call finishes. He put down his phone and returned his focus to Linda, who continued to have the card as if you're worried it might vanish. She gives him a wide-eyed, shocked gaze. Waring's face was one of thankfulness. I'm not sure how to express my gratitude, Keanu only whispers in a shaky voice. Shakes his head, saying, you don't just take a few moments to look after yourself and Max. Spectators who had been observing as the scenario develops, they whisper to one another. A few had been documenting the earlier noise, but these days their phones are reduced awareness dawning on their squints at a young man who is leaning with his pal. That's Keanu Reeves murmuring, guy. Circulates around the tiny group of people, some eyes enlarge in appreciation as others look back at Keanu after visiting Linda with gained admiration, yet he doesn't recognize that the attention isn't. All he does is crouch once for the cameras, more to gently give Max one last scratch. I think you have a good one behind your ears, he says, Linda, with a slight smile. Max swallows deeply and nods, then licks Keanu's hand as though expressing his own silent gratitude. Keanu gets back up and takes a step back as though to depart, but before doing so, he provides Linda one final glance that conveys something more profound than just goodwill. Look that conveys her importance. The plot isn't finished yet, thus. Silent grace, he disappears into the night, with only the echo remaining of a simple yet impactful gesture that everything changes when Keanu gets on his knees, giving Max a soft pat while discussing. His tone was calm and pleasant as he spoke warmly to Linda. Inquires as to how long she has been here. She pauses, then lets out a sigh, passing a weary palm over Max's. She tells him about the disheveled fur, months spent living on the streets during the evenings. Coldly contemplated how Max had discovered her curled up under a dumpster and had not abandoned her. Sighed after she describes how he growls at strangers who approach too closely. How? He tells her how much food she has. The only family she has left is him, Keanu. Never takes her eyes from his while she listens to his. His eyes were full yet his expression was unreadable. Of a sight she hasn't seen in a while. Time comprehension, he looks at Max who stares back at him with a slight tail thump. Against the sidewalk as though noticing. This stranger is unique without. Keanu decides after some deliberation that he opens his jacket and takes out a card. Gives it to Linda in a forceful voice. Steady, directing her to the address. Tomorrow informs her on the card that a cozy bed will be ready for her. Assures her that she and Max are not need to. She no longer sleeps on the streets. At her fingers, then at the card. Shuddering against her ragged edges. Blanket, uncertain as to whether she is dreaming or. Max nudges her hand pushing, this is real. She swallows hard and nods for her to accept it. Ultimately holding the card firmly, as though it is the most valuable item in the. Max gets one last chance from the world Keanu stands. Pat, letting her know she's not alone. Before leaving and vanishing. Like a shadow, Linda, into the city. Holds the card close to her heart. Striking her ribs for the first time. For the first time in ages, hope flickers too. Life within her. Max refused to back down. Till they disappeared, and then with a. He turned to Linda, prodding her with a faint whimper. Tears blazed in her eyes as he looked at her. Wonderful guy, as she drew him in close. She said, good lad, Max, from the. She saw people out of the corner of her eye. Continuing to observe a man using a phone. Dropped his face in contemplation of a woman. Nervously moved forward close to the cafe. Perhaps tonight would not end. The unhurried way she anticipated the crowd. Scattered whispers among themselves as they now put their phones away. Had gone by just another brief. The restless city incident, but one. Keanu Reeves was still alive.
Quietly seated at the cafe window, drinking his coffee when he became aware of the. Initially, the noise outside was just background noise from the typical chaos in the city. However, he then noticed a dog. Maximum Keanu observed the unkempt. The stray held his ground, defending without hesitation, the woman's loyalty. It struck him that he lacked the fortitude to step in during any argument on the street. However, something about this particular moment felt distinct from the gang of troublemakers. Keanu stood and vanished into the night, lowered his beanie above his head. I went outdoors, but Linda was still, holding Max and petting his fur in a calming rhythm. She was unaware of the man first approaching, but not until his, "Hey, Keanu," the shadow was extending across them, remarked in a forceful but calm tone. Linda looked up in surprise, as she was accustomed to, individuals halting for improper motives to, sneered a lecture as if they were interested, briefly before turning to leave. However, there was something about this man. Max noticed something strange about him as well. His ears pricked up, but he refrained from growling. Rather, he sniffed his tail in the air. With a slight wag, Keanu squatted down to meet the dog's eyes at Max's level. With all due respect, you are a courageous person. Max, he whispered, slowly reaching out. Paused, then pushed his hand, enabling Linda's touch. Blinked. Thanks, she said, uncertain. Keanu looked at her, unsure of what else to say, taking in the soiled clothing, the fatigue on her face, the manner in which she automatically held her body taut as though waiting for the world to hit us again. Before he realized it, he had witnessed battle. Well, are you okay? He inquired, and Linda paused. Most folks inquired without actually wishing to. A response, yet something in the manner in which she paused when I said it plainly. When she had finished speaking, Keanu nodded as If that response was entirely logical, then he reached into his pocket after a pause. He took out his wallet, saying, "I'd want to." He held out a couple crisps and said, "Help." Max Linda's bills for you looked at. In his perspective, the money wasn't sympathy. It was something else, not charity. Honor, perhaps acknowledgement of her F. She shuddered as she accepted the money. "Thank you," she muttered, and Keanu grinned, handing Max a final scrape behind the ears look after a friend, then with a nonchalant nod, he turned and left, fading away into the darkness as if he was absent. Linda sat frozen for a while. The money is still being held in the moment, weighing the consequences of what had just. Max leaned against her as it happened. Perhaps warmth was keeping her grounded in the present. Perhaps tonight would be different. Linda ultimately kept her head down, absent-mindedly stroking Max's unkempt fur, and though it was chilly at night, she had suffered more. She had come to fit in with the surroundings of the city, to create. She is tiny and invisible, but not. Everyone was happy to ignore her. Loud laughter filled the street, making fun of a bunch of young males wearing sneakers and pricey jackets that were out of sync. The scent of their breath nearing her was alcoholic beverages, and their eyes shone with, "Take a look at this one," mean-spirited amusement. One of them scoffed and nudged his friend. "Come on, lady, outside a cafe. This isn't." Linda, you strained and gripped your living room. She had noticed the edge of her blanket, this prior to harsh insults and drunken taunts. With her, it always ended the same way, pretending not to hear in the hopes that they would lose interest. The second man grinned. "I believe she enjoys this place. Perhaps we should assist her." He slung his bag before she could respond, foot in the direction of her modest mound of possessions. A tin cup, a worn backpack, and an outdated thermos and crumpled bills. Savage's kick never came down suddenly.
Max snarled and sprung to his feet, his fur. His teeth were bared and bristling in a rage. He growled as he sprang forward, putting himself between the men and Linda. Sharp, untamed bark sliced through the night air, halting the groups. Tracks who removed the item, one of. They stumbled backward and yelled, but Max refused to change his position. He was adamant about deep, menacing growls, yet he wasn't no longer only a stray dog, he was a defender. The disturbance attracted notice. Nearby pedestrians stop and converse. Anxious looks from others were moving their phones. A woman raised her camera in a gasp. A business-suited man scowled and Linda, still trembling, took a step forward. Out for Max, grazing his with her fingers. She said, "It's okay, boy," but he kept his gaze fixed on one of the men. Looking at the expanding throng. "Let's go, whatever the crazy dog." Another whispered, pulling of his companions. "This isn't worth it." With one final sleeve scowl, they turned and left there. The frigid laughter fades into the night. Through the streets, the wind howled. Los Angeles' downtown, navigating the high-rise towers and busy neon signs on the avenues flickered in the distant light, illuminating the vehicles with damp pavements honked impatiently as the pedestrian rushed forward, clad in scarves and heavy coats, ready to get away. The icy cold in the middle of the cities. An isolated individual sat with restlessness. Crouched on a frayed blanket close to At a busy junction, Linda pulled her tired. However, she pulled her coat firmly over herself. It didn't do much to prevent the cold from leaking into her bones and her rough fingers. And gripped a cardboard placard with a damaged hand. Anything helps with faded letters that are hungry. The majority of people passed without Some people gave her a quick look. Pity, but few intervened. She was a shadow among the world's invisible By her side, the glistening lights curled. Max was leaning against her for warmth. His ribs were hardly visible because of the matted fur under his unkempt coat, but his eyes were so devoted to the stray dog. Discovered Linda several months prior, just as lost and as unwelcome as she was, they had been inseparable and found solace in one another. Max raised his head in the presence of others. He watched the gathering, his ears twitching. His tail gave a feeble thump when Linda rubbed his back once more. "Max," she whispered, her breath coming through the cold air. "Perhaps things will improve tomorrow." A windstorm sent a discarded, fluttering newspapers on the sidewalk. Linda tucked her chin into her chest and moaned. Scarf, which she had long since learned not to expect strangers to be kind, but sometimes, just occasionally, fate has its way of shocking people who had lost everything. Hope and fate were both watching tonight.